Hello everyone, this is Space Cafe Podcast, and I'm Marcus. What do you do when you have an appointment with the Astrophysics director of NASA? In a town that's not only loud, but also fully booked with no silent spots available on the fly to make a recording. Taking him to your hotel room could mitigate the noise, but that's not really an option. You guessed it, it's the middle of South by Southwest season, and Austin, Texas is in full swing, to say the least, with 60,000 people, hundreds of events per day, and every room booked, literally. This place is bustling, and if you want to catch the last available utility room or cleaning closet for a decent, silent location for your recording, your wallet must be bustling as well. So I figured, you know what? I will put my microphones to the most radical test possible. I invited Dr. Mark Clampin to join me for a sundowner chat on a hotel terrace on the 5th floor, right in the middle of it all. The background noise was a nightmare for any podcaster. But maybe not. These days, artificial intelligence can make almost any loud noise magically go away, just like that. But then I figured, hey, not this time. I want you guys to also immerse yourselves in that moment that I enjoyed so much. No magic, just pure, down-to-earth me, Mark, and a fantastic Texas sundown. With Mark deciding to sit right against it, having to slightly squint his eyes, the right mood to talk about NASA's next big plans. Enjoy.
Thanks for taking the time.
Sure, it's a pleasure.
You just got back from an event. How was it? How was your session, your panel?
So my panel was discussing the James Webb Space Telescope and then trying to segue into what we're doing next in NASA Astrophysics. So I talked about the Roman Space Telescope and then further on concepts that we have on the drawing boards that we're trying to move forward right now, such as the Habitable Worlds Observatory.
So before we move into the future,
Yeah.
How is James Webb doing?
So Webb is doing really well, better than our wildest dreams.
Yeah.
I actually said in the podcast, that for many of us who worked on the project for so long, it's just, dream come true to see the quality of the science that it's been doing.
To get it up and running in the first place was a miracle?
Yeah.
And then to have those quality images.
Yes, I mean, you work on these programs for a very long time, and I worked on Webb for 14 years as the observatory project scientist, and then after that, I was managing the whole Webb science team for another 7 or 8 years. So I've always kind of been heavily involved with Webb and what it was doing. And, when you work on things at that level, you kind of know all the issues, and those are the things you fret about, and they're the things you should fret about.
Sure.
But when it launches, that you're sitting there ticking them off as you go through all the elements of the sort of launch phase, from the launch and then the first deployment and the second and the third. So that first 6 months was pretty
intense,
harrowing, just going through, ticking the list one by one. But at the end of it, we get this amazing image and we look at it and go, wow, this is much deeper than we'd all calculated. And
wow,
we realized the telescope's more sensitive.
Wow.
That the image quality is better than we had planned. The pointing is better. And everything deployed perfectly. I mean, what more could you ask?
What's your favorite image?
I think my favorite image is still that very first light image that the president unveiled.
Yeah.
Just because for me, it's so unusual to do, what was ostensibly a first light image to show the press. And one of the things I said at the event we were just speaking at, I just saw a paper come out last week still discussing that first image and the data that was contained in it.
And that's just one image?
That's just one image, yes.
So how many images do you get? On a weekly basis or?
No, that's a really good question. I think it varies a lot. So I really couldn't answer that. But, it depends a lot on the kind of science that's being done. The images typically don't take as long as the spectroscopic observations, which are much longer. So in any given week, it's a mix. So it's hard to say we get so many images in a certain period of time.
Yeah. How about those micrometeorite bombardments? Are they still happening? I guess they are factored into the whole mission process. They're not a surprise, I guess.
So the micrometeoroids are not a surprise. And in fact, I can tell you, I started on Webb in 2003 as the observatory project scientist. And the micrometeoroids are factored into the optical performance on the very first day. We have a model that the Marshall Space Flight Center maintains of micrometeoroid flux at L2. And what we're seeing pretty much matches that model. We've seen one micrometeoroid that was a lot more, had a bigger impact on the mirror. And we think that's just because it hit a particularly critical area. We have this structure on the back of the mirror we call the strung back, which is a series of ribs. They're attached to an actuator in the middle that adjusts the mirror focus. We think it hit one of those. So it appeared to do more damage than it actually did just because we think it hit that structure. But we have 6 degrees of freedom on each mirror, so we can make a lot of adjustments to remove the aberration it caused.
Good. So now let's talk about the future. What up next? What does NASA have up its sleeve when it comes to new projects? I just had the ELT project manager on the show.
Yes.
So we spoke quite extensively about ELT. Now we got James Webb. So how can we go beyond all this?
So what we do next in NASA is determined by the decadal survey. So we get marching orders once a decade from the national academies who conduct what's called a decadal survey. And they basically collect a large group of astronomers and essentially say, what are the priorities for this decade? What's the most important problems that we can work on? And in 2010, the most important problem was understanding the nature of dark energy and dark matter. So a current mission, which comes from the 2010 decadal, is the Roman Space Telescope, which is named after Nancy Grace Roman, who was one of the first science administrators at NASA. And that program will consist of a 2.4 meter telescope, but it's our very first flagship that does surveys. So if you think back to some of the other missions that we've launched, like Hubble and Chandra and Spitzer, and Webb indeed, they're all what I call point and shoot. They look at a place on the sky and take a very deep image or spectrum. Roman instead is a survey mission. So it has a field of view 100 times bigger than Hubble's, and it will survey a big part of the sky, taking observations of galaxies and supernova to get a much better understanding of the nature of dark energy, which is this force that we think is making the universe accelerate as it expands. It will also allow us to really understand the nature of dark matter, which is this unseen element in galaxies that we know is, vital constituent, from measurements that we've made of the rotation rate of galaxies, and which we also understand from gravitational lenses. Roman's also going to do other things. It's a survey mission, so it will provide us with a really amazing view of the infrared sky, and large surveys produce lots of very unique science that can only be done when you cover a large part of the sky. One other thing it will do, for instance, is a survey of the galactic bulge, and we will be able to look for gravitationally lensed exoplanets, and that will allow us to really fill in our understanding of what exoplanet systems look like. We know what the inner parts look like, but we don't have a good idea of the statistics of the outer regions. And we need to understand that information as we start to think about the 2020 decadal survey, where we've been told to build an observatory that we're going to be calling, for the time being, the Habitable Worlds Observatory. And that will survey nearby stars, looking for habitable planets, and then characterizing them to look for signs of life. But unlike previous missions where we're really focused on transits or mini eclipses, Roman and then the Habitable Worlds will actually be taking images.
Yes.
So on Roman, we're flying a technology demonstration of a coronagraph. And this is an instrument that basically blocks out the light from a central star so you can see that faint material around it. But to do that, you have to really flatten out the wavefront error from the telescope. And, the telescope wavefront error at nanometer and less levels is always changing because of the thermal variations in the mirror. So this is the first time we've flown what we call an active coronagraph. It's measuring the wavefront all the time and then correcting it with two deformable mirrors that bend their shape to adjust those perturbations in the wavefront error. So that will be a technology demonstration and will allow us to image gas giant planets like Jupiter. And then with the habitable worlds, we'll go 100 to 1,000 times better and try to image small Earth-like planets that are potentially habitable. And for that, we need to go to contrast levels of 10 billion. So that's a really challenging requirement. And it also requires the telescope to be stable at the level of tens of picometers. So 100 to 1,000 times more stable than Webb.
That's mind-blowing.
The whole telescope has to be actively controlled, not just the coronagraph.
Do you have a favorite question that should be answered? Because you just mentioned dark matter and actual planets. Do you have a favorite that should be answered first and then the rest?
So I think for me, it's really NASA's search for life and, is there life out there in the universe? So for me, it's really pursuing the question of, do these planets show evidence of life?
Yes. So what do you think? What's your best guess? I just had Lisa Kaltenegger on the show from the Carl Sagan Institute.
Yes, I know Lisa.
And we spoke, of course, we talked about just that. And Lisa said that from a technical perspective, we will know if we're alone or not alone within the next 10 years because we have the technical capabilities. So what's your guess? Are we alone?
I think we're not, and I would agree with Lisa. I'm not sure 10 years, but I think Habitable Worlds will be the mission that really answers that question. I think it will take a bit longer than 10 years to get it built and flown. But yes, we will answer that question.
Actually, we're living in a very decisive moment in time.
Absolutely.
For the first time, we may find out.
I look at it this way, when I was a kid, I watched Star Trek. I'm embarrassed to say I'm old enough that I watched the first series when it first came out. And, one of the things I always wondered is, are there really that many planets? And, do they really are they going to look like that when we find them?
Yeah.
Well, now we've found them. We've found some like 5,000 planets around other stars that we've confirmed as planets. And there's another backlog of 10,000 that are candidates we haven't confirmed yet. We know many of these are in systems. So in just the last 20 years, we've come so far towards answering that question. So we're going to make progress and we're going to get to the point where we can really answer these questions.
It's also fascinating to remind ourselves that our knowledge of the universe is not very old. It's not that long that we found out that our galaxy is not the only one, or our solar system is not the only one. So we should remind ourselves that we are in the middle of finding out.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I've just been astonished, in the age of Hubble, Chandra, Spitzer, and now Webb, we've made so many discoveries that have completely overturned, our previous understanding of the universe, of astrophysics, of our place in it, how planets form, how stars form. We've just rewritten the textbooks. And
is this also a moment in time where because now everything is about artificial intelligence, maybe this is also a moment in time where we need artificial intelligence to dig through that data, because we're producing so much data that it's impossible to dig through it without technological support.
Absolutely. And, I will say when I was the science manager at Goddard, I managed not just astrophysics, but several other science divisions, including the Earth Science Division. And I was always very impressed that they seemed to be way ahead of the crowd on using these artificial intelligence, machine learning techniques to infuse different data sets and then, make discoveries using machine learning. And, we were able to essentially grab time on their systems. They had this massive GPU stack. And a good example is we ran the test 2-year database and found, another 150 planets just using machine learning.
Interesting.
And some of them were really interesting because they were things that we weren't expecting to find, like dust clouds created by colliding asteroids. So as we go into the era of Roman, where we're going to be generating petabytes of data, yes, artificial intelligence and machine learning are just a fundamental part of how we will have to sort through the data.
Fantastic. I'm always curious to find out what we can learn from projects like James Webb, like not the space industry, but other industries. So because there's lots of project management in there. So what is it that society, the corporate world can learn from such projects?
So, Webb is an interesting project because at the time we were building it, there was obviously a lot of concern that we'd run over. But we always ran Webb with a very strong project management focus and really focused on the leadership aspects that would get us to the finish line. And for me, part of that was having a badgeless team, continually questioning what we were doing. And what I mean by that is risk analysis. So I got asked a short while ago about how do we track all the risks and concerns? And we had a very open and inclusive approach, which was that anybody on the project, anybody could raise a risk, write it into the database, and then we would have to bring in the system engineering team and disposition that risk. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of them, they would say, we've looked at this and it's not a valid risk, but they had to clearly explain why. And then others, they would say, oh, yes, this is actually something we hadn't thought of. We better go figure out what to do.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
So it's everyone has a voice.
Everybody had a voice on that program. And I told the audience that, there are a couple of risks in a database I remember writing about making sure that we could clean the mirrors. So having clean mirrors on JW was essential to having very low sky backgrounds that weren't dominated by scattered light, because the telescope's not in the tube. It's just looking at the sky. And so if you have more than, % or so on the mirrors of dust coverage, you will start to see stray light from the universe, which is kind of a strange concept. So we realized as the program was, progressing that we were going to have to clean the mirrors. And, the risk that I put in came true, and we looked at 2 different approaches and adopted one of them once we tested it.
Fantastic.
So that's an example, but there were hundreds of others.
The world is teeming with problems these days, as we know. Do you think that project managers from James Webb or similar projects could solve our very mundane problems differently? Because we are in desperate need to solve those problems.
Sure.
I'm not only talking about climate change, but of course it's a valid problem that needs to be solved.
I think one of the things, when you talk about solving problems outside of, astrophysics missions, there also needs to be a commitment to do it right. So if you look at our James Webb team, we had a very strong commitment to build that telescope and make sure it worked on the day. So a lot of it just comes down to having committed people who are really in it for the long haul, if need be, to solve this problem.
And a very clear goal.
And a clear goal. And that's kind of where we've been on Roman. So with Roman, we have a different challenge, which is that, we're trying to accomplish that mission to do a very different kind of science, but we're also very focused this time on finishing on cost and schedule as well. And that's a goal that we've been set by congressional stakeholders. So it's different goals, but we're focused on them in just the same way.
How do you deal with the frustration of having to invent most of the parts and constituents of such projects? Because I could imagine that most of the things that are needed now for the next telescope are not off the shelf at the moment.
Right, but that's part of the excitement of working on these programs. Every astrophysics mission we do, whether it's a small one or a large one, is in some way a one-off, where you really have to do something that's never been done before. And the bigger the program, the more things that have never been done before, but you still have the excitement of trying to figure out how to solve those problems.
But what if you don't? So, for example, theory requires a certain coating for a mirror, and you can't come up with it. You cannot solve that problem. Would that be the end of the whole project?
No, because
things
then
like
we'll
that happen?
work on a mitigation.
Okay.
This is part of our risk process. By the time we get to the point where we realize it doesn't work, most times somebody's already said this is a risk that we might not get there. And we've already said, okay, so if we don't get there, what is the mitigation? How do we go a different route if we have to? So we kind of look at it that way. And I can see, as I start thinking about habitable worlds, I can see many of these potential forks in the road, if you like, where we can't do it one way, we'll have to go another way.
Yeah.
And coatings are one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely different question. Is SLS a dead end?
I think right now that it's moving forward, and NASA is fully intending to use SLS for its Artemis program. We, as I think about habitable worlds, are looking at ways of optimizing our program, and one of the things that we're looking at is large launchers that provide us with that necessary volume and mass margin that we don't have with the current round of launchers. So we have SLS, and there are other companies, SpaceX and Starship, making similar large volume.
But Starship is reusable, so SLS can never be competitive.
Right now, I think it's too early to say.
Yeah. Okay. But the Europeans have the same problem with Ariane 6.
I would imagine so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. In one of the panels here at South by Southwest, we heard the crisis in science about the science education, about the rapid death of science magazines, popular science magazines, everything transitioning into digital, and a lack of appreciation in society for science. It's a waning appreciation. It's the same in Europe. Austria, my native country, we used to have like Nobel laureates like on a yearly basis 100 years ago. But this has completely turned into the opposite. Like Austria is at the moment at the very end of the European countries when it comes to a society that appreciates the necessity of science and the benefits of science. Here in the United States, I hear it's about 53% of people understanding that science is important. Do you think that scientists are doing something wrong, that have been doing something wrong? And how can we mitigate that problem?
I'm not sure that scientists are doing anything wrong, but I do recognize that scientists need to be really proactive in communicating what they're doing. And, we in astrophysics and in the Science Mission Director at NASA headquarters, a big part of our programs is, talking about the science that we do. We're all expected to go and give talks, explain not just what we're finding, but why we do it, what the value is to society, what the value is to, American industry. So we continue to be very proactive in talking about what we're doing. I'm not sure, what the numbers in the US look like, but we continue to see a lot of interest certainly in astrophysics, in the science that we do and the engagement. We just filled a room with 400 people without without too much of a problem. So whenever we give talks about the science that NASA does, we bring in a lot of people who want to hear about it. And I continue to see a lot of scientists and engineers and program managers who not only come into NASA telling us that one of the things that inspired them was what we did on Hubble or Chandra or Webb, mainly, obviously the older missions right now, but I expect Webb will do the same. But, I also meet a lot of people in industry who say that the kind of things we do in NASA are what inspired them to go into a STEM career. Mm-hmm. So I think we're still working very hard to do that. And I think, our stakeholders continue to recognize that because they continue to fund us.
Mm-hmm. It seems like we're undergoing a major transformation as humanity in many, many directions, wherever that transformation is headed. Also, a transformation when it comes to space exploration. What's your take on where all this is headed? Are we becoming an interplanetary species? Or is that too early?
I think it's too early certainly for me, it's too early to say. But I'm, really encouraged by the growth in commercial space. Certainly in the US, we see a lot of new companies springing up. A lot of our payloads are launched by commercial space now, by companies who weren't launching them 10 years ago. And I think it's really exciting to watch that develop and see new opportunities. And it's certainly changed how we look at putting together our missions now. 10, 15 years ago, there may have been, 4 or 5 companies that could build a spacecraft bus. Now there are a lot more. And many of them are not even interested in working with us because they're focused on, say, communications or something else. But it's really encouraging just to see the growth in commercial space in America because it's like a rising tide. It takes us all with it, right? Mm-hmm. So. Mm-hmm. And in fact, as I said, for Habitable Worlds Observatory, we're looking at using large rocket fairings on these new large generation launchers. We're also looking at all the work and the companies that are working on things like cislunar logistics and going to the moon and saying, well, we can use that to go and do robotic servicing at L2. So we're going to design this telescope to be serviced at L2. And, that will require not just, the hardware capability, but, autonomous servicing. So that's AI, ML. So it also brings in a lot of new technologies as well.
I've always wondered, because you very briefly mentioned, or the more science fiction-y part of things, why don't we have a huge spaceship already, like the Star Trek type spaceships that are traveling around? I mean, I'm not talking about warp drives. I'm just talking about a huge spaceship that travels around, not just the space station out there. Why don't we have something like this? Because that would make space exploration a lot easier, I guess. Where's the problem with that?
I think up until recently, it's just been the cost of doing it, because really it was just governments who are launching and flying space hardware. And of course, that's expensive and it has to compete with other national priorities. Now you're seeing this, as I just said, proliferation of commercial space companies who are finding new and cheaper ways to launch things. So I fully expect that as time goes by, we'll get there. But it's still going to take a long time, because
you need the payload capacity to bring...
Right. You have the inescapable physics of what it takes to get mass to orbit.
Yes.
And, there are more companies who can do that, but getting large amounts of mass to orbit is still the really major issue you have to contend with.
Yeah. But what are the most interesting plans in the drawers in regard to that? So if the physics problem to get things into orbit is solved, what are the most interesting projects out there?
So that's a good question, and I'm trying to avoid highlighting individual commercial entities. But, so I'll talk about NASA. NASA's planning to go back to the moon, and we're not just going back for another visit. We're going back to stay and then eventually to go on to Mars. And I think right now that's a, really nice goal to be focusing on as you talk about returning to space as a human race in a big way.
Would you go into space if the call came?
I would go like a shot, yes.
You would go?
Absolutely. Would my family be happy about that? That's a different question.
Do they know that you would go?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. No, I'm just asking. Of course, you know a lot better than me that it will be a very boring journey wherever you go, because it's a long journey.
Yes.
Which one tune wouldn't you want to miss on that journey? Which one piece of music?
If I had to pick just one, I would probably pick the Bach Violin Concerto No. 1.
Good.
So the second movement, preferably the Hilary Hahn version.
Wonderful, wonderful. And the last question, this show is called the Space Cafe Podcast. It's a coffee place.
Yes.
Coffee is good if you want to energize yourself, if you're tired. Now, why don't you share an espresso for the mind with me to energize, as an energizer for audiences? What could be an espresso for the mind? And you can pick whatever kind of topic you want to pick.
That's an interesting question. I guess I would encourage people to think about what science does in their lives. So I'll give you an example. I used to be the chief editor of a journal for one of the big optics societies. And we sat down one day and just said, what has optics done in our life? And when you sit down and start to think about even just one scientific discipline and what has it done for our lives, how has it enriched them, A, the list gets very long very quickly, and B, you realize just where you'd be without science and technology. So that would be my suggestion. Think about a science discipline and what it's done to enrich your life.
And try to find out the one thing where science is not needed at all. And I think you won't come up with anything.
I agree, yes.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
That's a wrap on today's episode of the Space Cafe Podcast. Thanks to our guest for taking us behind the scenes at NASA and giving us a peek at what's next in astrophysics. Their stories really light up the imagination, don't they? I hope you enjoyed the backdrop of a buzzing Austin evening as much as I did. No filters or tweaks, just us, the sunset, and a slice of the big, bustling world of South by Southwest. And hey, if you enjoyed the show, do us a big favor and drop us a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really helps us reach more space enthusiasts like you. Until then, catch you next time on the Space Cafe Podcast, where we will dive into more stellar conversations. Safe travels, my friends, through the stars. Bye-bye.